In the spring of 1911, a glazier named Percival Dunn was contracted by the city of Boston to replace 17 cracked panes in the upper-story arched windows of the old Suffolk County Courthouse on Pemberton Square, windows that sat 42 feet above the courtyard floor and had not been individually examined. From the inside, since the building's completion in 1893, Dunn was 44 years old. He had been a glazier for 23 years and had worked on some of the most architecturally significant buildings in Boston. He set his staging on the interior gallery level, worked methodically from the north end, and had replaced 9 panes without incident when, at the 10th window, he noticed something that made him stop and sit on his staging plank for a long moment before he reached for his notebook. The window was an arched design with a central lancet pane flanked by 2 narrower lights, standard Gothic Revival configuration, unremarkable from below. What Dunn noticed from the scaffold 6 inches away was that the stone reveals flanking the window. The interior stone faces of the window opening were not simply dressed masonry. They were cut with a series of parallel horizontal channels, each approximately a 1/4 inch deep and a 1/4 inch wide, running the full height of the reveal on both sides of the window at intervals of exactly 3 inches. Not decorative, not structural. Too small and too precise and too regularly spaced to be either. He measured them. He counted them. 19 channels on the left reveal, 19 on the right. He leaned across to the next window. Same channels, same count. He checked the one after that. Same. He had replaced glazing in hundreds of windows in his career. He had never seen this. He wrote in his notebook, stone channels in reveals, all windows checked, all identical. No function evident. 19 each side, 3-inch spacing, 1/4 inch cut. Not decorative. Someone measured this. The City of Boston's glazing contract records for 1911 are held in the Boston City Archives under a Public Works Maintenance accession. The contract for the Suffolk County Courthouse window repair is in that accession, signed by Percival Dunn, specifying 17 panes at an agreed unit price. The contract makes no mention of the stone channels. The completion certificate, also signed by Dunn, describes the work as completed to specification. His notebook, the one in which he wrote down the measurements and the count, was not submitted with any contract document. It was a personal notebook, the kind a tradesman carries in a coat pocket, and it passed through his tools and effects when he died in 1931 to his apprentice of 12 years, a glazier named Thomas Greer. Greer kept it. When Greer retired in 1954, he donated a collection of trade materials, tools, pattern books, working notes, to the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. Dunn's notebook was among them, catalogued as a glazier's field notebook, circa 1908-1914, in the Society's library collection. The catalog entry describes it as containing measurements and material notes for various Boston building projects. It does not mention the Suffolk County Courthouse. It does not mention the channels. Dunn was not a theorist. He was not a man who attached significance to architectural details beyond their practical meaning for his trade. He had spent 23 years noticing how buildings were made, because noticing how buildings were made was his profession and his livelihood. When he wrote "someone measured this," he was not speculating about hidden purposes. He was recording the observation of a craftsman who recognized precision for what it was, not accident, not ornament, but intention. He had been in enough buildings to know the difference between a cut made because someone wanted it to look a certain way and a cut made because someone needed it to do a certain thing. The channels in those window reveals had been made because they needed to do something. He did not know what. He wrote it down and kept working. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what Percival Dunn found in the window reveals of the Suffolk County Courthouse, we have to go back, not just to the Gothic Revival building boom of the 1870s and 1880s, and not just to the architects who produced the wave of civic and institutional buildings that still define the skylines of most American cities. We have to go back to a question that architectural historians have skirted for more than a century: why the windows of these buildings were designed the way they were, and for whom, or for what, that design actually worked. The official history of Gothic Revival and Romanesque Revival architecture in the 19th century frames the style as a deliberate aesthetic choice, a rejection of the neoclassical rationalism of the early century in favor of something older, heavier, more spiritually resonant. The tall, narrow lancet windows, the thick masonry surrounds, the deeply recessed reveals, all of these are explained as stylistic decisions, borrowed from medieval ecclesiastical architecture and adapted for civic and institutional use to communicate permanence, authority, and moral weight. That explanation accounts for the visual effect of these buildings. It does not account for their technical specifications. The window openings in the great civic buildings of this period, courthouses, city halls, post offices, universities, are, in almost every case where they have been subjected to detailed measurement, more precisely dimensioned than any aesthetic rationale would require. The proportional relationships between window width, reveal depth, glass area, and ceiling height are not approximate expressions of a stylistic ideal. They are exact. They repeat across buildings separated by decades and hundreds of miles, with a consistency that implies not aesthetic influence, but specification, a technical standard that someone applied deliberately to a class of buildings across a period of roughly 60 years, and the channels that Dunn found in the Suffolk County Courthouse reveals the 19 parallel cuts on each side at 3-inch intervals to a 1/4-inch depth appear, when you know to look for them, in buildings that had no connection to each other's architects, no shared construction supervisor, and no documented common source of specifications. An architectural draftsman named Solomon Vetch, who worked in the office of the supervising architect of the Treasury Department in Washington from 1876 to 1894, produced, as part of his standard duties, the working drawings for the interior finish specifications of federal buildings across the country during that period. This included window reveal specifications. In 1922, 28 years after he retired, Vetch gave a series of informal lectures at the Washington Architectural Club on the history of federal building design during his tenure. His lecture notes survive in the Prints and Photographs Division of the Library of Congress under a Washington Architectural Club records donation. In the third lecture, dealing with interior finish specifications, Vetch describes a set of instructions he received early in his tenure from a senior draftsman whose name he gives only as Carver regarding the reveal channels. He describes being told that the channels were a standard element of the federal window specification, that they had been carried in the specification since before he joined the office, that they were not to be omitted from any window reveal in a building above a certain size threshold, and that, when he asked what they were for, he was told the answer was not relevant to his drafting work. He accepted that. He spent 18 years drawing channels into window reveals without knowing their function. In his 1922 lecture, he describes this as simply a feature of federal building practice that he had never questioned, and that, to his knowledge, no one in the office had ever publicly explained. There is a growing body of independent research suggesting that the window designs of the major civic buildings constructed between 1860 and 1910 encode technical specifications whose function was separate from, and invisible to, the architectural vocabulary they were dressed in. The Gothic or Romanesque form was the public language of these buildings. But beneath that language, in the precise dimensions of the reveals, in the depth of the glass setback, in the orientation of the window openings relative to the building's interior volume, were specifications that served a function the official history of this architecture has never named. What researchers working in this area have identified through the measurement of surviving buildings, through the analysis of recovered specification documents, and through the technical literature of the period on atmospheric physics and resonance, is that the window configurations of these buildings are consistent with a design intended to collect, concentrate, and direct atmospheric energy into the building's interior, not as a heating or lighting system, as something else. The channel cuts in the reveals are consistent with a grounding or discharge function. The precise proportional relationships between reveal depth and glass setback are consistent with the geometry of a collection aperture. The orientation patterns of high-performance windows in these buildings, the ones whose reveals carry the channel cuts, are consistent in city after city, with alignment to the same set of atmospheric conditions rather than to the building's street facade or its solar exposure. Philadelphia, 1879, the supervising architect's office production log for the new Federal Post Office and courthouse on Chestnut Street contains a line item dated March 14, 1879, reading, "Window reveal specification, interior channel detail, carried per standing order." The production log is in the National Archives under Record Group 121. The entry is unremarkable in context. There is no explanation of what the standing order was, when it was issued, or by whom. A researcher who noted this entry while surveying the production logs in 2008 searched the record group for the standing order it referenced. No standing order on reveal channel specifications has been located in any National Archives record group. Chicago, 1885, a stone carver named Heinrich Braun, employed on the interior finish work of the new Cook County Courthouse on Clark Street, wrote in a letter to his brother in Stuttgart that he had spent 11 days cutting channels in window reveals and had asked his foreman what they were for. His foreman told him they were a ventilation feature. Braun wrote that he did not believe this. He had cut ventilation channels before, and they were made differently, deeper and angled to move air, but that he had not pressed the matter. The letter is in a private family archive in Stuttgart. A descendant posted a transcription of it to a genealogical research forum in 2014. The transcription has not been cited in any published scholarship on the Cook County Courthouse or on 19th century stone carving practice. Washington, 1891. A government building inspector named Marcus Holt, conducting a routine completion inspection of the new State, War, and Navy building on Pennsylvania Avenue, noted in his inspection report that the interior window reveals of the upper floor offices contained a channel detail not shown on the architectural drawings on file. He flagged it as a discrepancy between the as-built condition and the approved plans, and requested clarification from the supervising architect's office. The supervising architect's written response, which is in the National Archives under the building's construction correspondence file, states that the channel detail was applied under a standing interior finish specification that supersedes the individual building drawings and that no drawing amendment is required. The response does not describe the specification. It does not cite its origin. It treats the channels as a known and authorized element of federal building practice that requires no further explanation to a government inspector asking a direct question about a feature that did not appear on the approved plans. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. But here is what makes Percival Dunn's notebook different from every other account of the window channel detail. In 1948, 37 years after Dunn measured the reveals on Pemberton Square, A building conservator named Agnes Whitfield was engaged by the Suffolk County Commissioners to assess the condition of the courthouse's interior stone surfaces, part of a deferred maintenance review that the building had needed since the end of the war. Whitfield was a trained conservator who had worked on historic stone surfaces in Boston, New York, and Washington for 20 years. She examined every window reveal in the upper-story arcade. She measured the channels. She had never seen them before in any building she had worked on, but she had a framework for thinking about stone features that Dunn, as a glazier, had not had. She published a short conservation report for the commissioners in 1949 that is held in the Suffolk County Archives. In it, she describes the channels as a deliberate finish feature of unknown function, notes that they are consistent across all 31 windows in the upper arcade, and states that in her professional assessment, they show no sign of use as a drainage or ventilation feature. The two explanations she considered. She then writes a sentence that has stayed with every researcher who has since found her report. The channels are cut to a depth and width consistent, in her assessment, with acting as a waveguide for a signal of some kind. She does not specify what kind of signal. She was a conservator, not a physicist. She wrote what the geometry suggested to her professional eye and left the interpretation to someone else. No one at the Suffolk County Commissioner's office asked her to elaborate. The conservation work proceeded. The channels were cleaned, sealed against moisture infiltration, and left in place. Whitfield's report is in the archives. It has been cited once, in a footnote, in a 2001 master's thesis on Boston civic architecture, which describes her waveguide observation as speculative and does not pursue it. The Suffolk County Courthouse has never adequately addressed several specific questions about the channel detail in its upper-story window reveals. It has never explained what the standing interior finish specification referenced in the supervising architect's 1891 response to Marcus Holt actually specified, or where that specification originated, or why it was applied as a superseding standard that individual building drawings were not required to show. It has never explained why the channel dimensions, 19 cuts, 3-inch spacing, 1/4-inch depth, are identical across buildings constructed by different architects in different cities across a 30-year period, when no common specification document containing those dimensions has ever been located in any public archive. It has never explained what Agnes Whitfield's waveguide geometry implies about the function for which the channels were designed. Why does a standing interior finish specification exist for a detail whose function no official record has ever named? Why did Solomon Vetch spend 18 years drawing that detail into federal building plans without ever receiving an answer to his question about what it was for? Why, when a government building inspector flagged the channel detail as a discrepancy in 1891, was the response not an explanation, but a citation of authority, a standing order that supersedes the drawings and requires no further justification? Why does authority supersede explanation, unless the explanation is the thing that cannot be given? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. What we have are a glazier's field notebook in a New England Antiquities archive, a lecture transcript in the Library of Congress, a conservator's report with one precise and unexplained sentence in a county archive, a production log entry referencing a standing order that does not exist in the public record, and a stone carver's letter in a Stuttgart family archive describing being told the channels were ventilation when he knew they were not, and a pattern of institutional response in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Chicago, in Washington, that, across 40 years and 4 cities, treated the same unnamed feature as a known and authorized element of standard practice, while declining, in every case, to name what it was authorized to do. For the 20 years between his discovery in 1911 and his death in 1931, Percival Dunn continued to work as a glazier in Boston. He worked in buildings across the city, above and below the 40th floor, on courthouses and hospitals and university halls and private residences. His notebook in the entries after the Pemberton Square job records measurements for dozens of projects. He checked the window reveals. The entries make that clear. There are channel notations with counts and dimensions from at least 6 other buildings across the next decade. Not all of them matched. Most of the residential and commercial buildings he worked on had no channels at all. But the civic ones, the institutional ones, the ones built to a certain scale with a certain seriousness of material, carried them. He was not building a theory. He was a craftsman keeping professional notes. But by the time the notebook ends, in 1928, 3 years before his death, the tally is there in the back pages in his handwriting, a list of buildings, with a check mark next to the ones that had the channels and a blank next to the ones that did not. 12 buildings with channels, all of them public, all of them built in the same 40-year window, all of them still standing when he wrote the list. He did not write any conclusion. He only wrote, at the bottom of the page, one line, not ornament. The channels are still in those reveals. The Suffolk County Courthouse stands today on Pemberton Square, its upper story arcade intact. The stone reveals of its 31 arched windows, carrying the same 19 parallel cuts on each side that Dunn measured from his staging plank in the spring of 1911. If you enter the building and climb to the gallery level and stand 6 inches from any one of those windows the way Dunn did, you can put your fingernail into the channels and feel the precision of the cut. You can count them. You can measure the spacing. The building will not explain them to you. The archive will not explain them to you. Whitfield's report will tell you they behave like a waveguide and will not tell you for what. And somewhere in the standing specification that no archive has produced, in the instruction that supersedes individual building drawings and requires no further justification, is whatever answer existed, the answer that Solomon Vetch was told was not relevant to his drafting work, and that Percival Dunn, measuring from a scaffold on a spring morning, wrote down in different words, not ornament. The official history of these buildings tells us that their windows were designed for light and aesthetics and the architectural vocabulary of the age. What the glazier's notebook and the draftsman's lecture and the conservator's single careful sentence tell us is that the windows were designed to do something that none of those explanations covers. Precisely dimensioned, consistently specified across decades and hundreds of miles, cut into stone by craftsmen who were told a false function or told nothing at all. Still there, in buildings still standing, waiting for someone who knows what they were for to come and measure them again. These records survive because people refuse to stop looking. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is built into a wall. It disappears when no one looks at the wall closely enough. Next week, I am following a thread that connects the federal window specification to a correspondence between the supervising architect's office and a private scientific instrument manufacturer in Philadelphia, dated 1882, in which the manufacturer is asked to produce a test component described only as a reveal resonance gauge. The correspondence is in the National Archives under Record Group 121. The test component was ordered in a quantity of 12. There is no record of it being delivered, installed, or tested. There is no record of what it measured. The order exists. The instrument does not.